There was a moment, deep inside a stone chamber sealed from all sunlight, when Han stopped breathing. The darkness entered him, not gradually but all at once, pressing into his chest, his blood, the space behind his vision, and his health counter dropped to 0 in 4 seconds. The woman on the altar above him, ancient and hollowed out by decades of corruption, looked down at the man who had just taken her curse into himself. Her face showed something it had not held in a very long time. Grief, raw and unguarded. The room held its silence. Han was dead. The remarkable thing was that he had walked into those chamber doors already knowing this might happen. He had calculated the odds, understood them clearly, and gone in anyway. To understand why a person makes that choice, you have to start much earlier. A small apartment in a city that didn't notice him, a debt that had been eating through his life for months before it swallowed everything whole, and a VR capsule lying in pieces on the floor. Han had been 14 when his father died. The grief never settled into a clean shape. It just sat in him, dense and permanent, the way an old scar sits. His mother took every available job. She worked until her body decided it was finished, before her will did, and on the day she collapsed at the factory floor, Han was in school with no way to know. By the time he reached the hospital, the nurses were already speaking in the careful, lowered register that signals the situation has passed the point of good news. He was essentially alone after that. The apartment stayed small, the bills did not. The game was the one thing that had never failed him. He had poured years into the Eternal Fields. Every dungeon mapped, every NPC pattern memorized, every rare spawn charted across multiple attempts. He had clawed his way, through failure and repetition and careful planning, to the role of Steel Elector, one of the most powerful military and political positions the game offered. He understood its economy, its faction structures, its hidden mechanics, and its most punishing secrets, at a level almost no other player reached. The game gave him what life outside it mostly hadn't, a place where effort and knowledge produced results that held. Then the debt collectors arrived. He owed money for the VR capsule, purchased on borrowed credit, because cheaper equipment couldn't reach the game's upper content. 2 men came to his apartment while he was logged in. He heard them through the capsule's external audio and tried to disconnect before they reached anything critical. He was a half-second too slow. The capsule broke apart, and Han found himself back in his real apartment with nothing but a debt notice and the memory of a world he could no longer access. That was when Aquila appeared. She stepped into the room with the ease of someone entering a space they already own, unhurried, elegant, entirely untroubled by the surroundings. She introduced herself as the administrator of a special anniversary world, a new version of the game, more immersive and complete than any previous release, built to mark a major milestone. She had been watching his progress for some time, she said. She called him her VIP. Complete certain objectives inside the new world, she promised, and the reward would be enough to clear the debt entirely. Every instinct Han possessed said something was wrong with this offer. He accepted it anyway, because she was giving him back the only thing he still cared about. What Aquila chose not to mention, not until the transition was already complete and the door had sealed behind him, was that the new world had no respawn mechanic. Death inside it would not end his session, it would end his life. If his health reached 0 in this world, there was no recovery, no retry, no return. He was already standing in a wet, dark forest when she finished explaining. The door was gone. He stood there for one moment, just one, letting it register. Then he started moving northeast, because standing still in an unfamiliar forest with almost no health remaining makes a bad situation considerably worse. The forest smelled of rot and deep undergrowth. His system panel showed numbers embarrassing for any character above tutorial level. Almost no health, no weapons worth counting, no class. What the panel couldn't display was the other thing he had brought into this world. Years of accumulated memory from previous runs through games built on this same engine, these same rules. Not this exact version, but close enough that the ground felt recognizable underfoot, the way a route feels familiar in the dark when you have walked it enough times in daylight. He knew this forest. The creek lay 200 meters east. Which plants in this region were safe and which would make the problem worse, he knew as well. And he knew, with the specific clarity of someone who has studied a danger long enough that the danger becomes workable, exactly who occupied the territory 3 kilometers deeper into the trees. 5 witches, a coven, the word implying more cooperative organization than they actually possessed. The truth was simpler. They despised each other. Decades of forced proximity had layered grievance on top of grievance, until the accumulated resentment was the heaviest thing any of them carried. A curse kept them bound to this stretch of forest, and a prohibition baked into that curse kept them from acting on the anger. Strip the prohibition away, and they would tear each other apart without any outside help required. Han had discovered this in an earlier run, the hard way, a direct approach that had gone badly before certain things the witches said to each other in the ensuing confrontation made the underlying dynamic clear. He had nearly died learning it. That information was now worth considerably more than it had cost. He reached their clearing just before dawn, when the light was flat and gray and the mist sat low. All five were visible, gathered around a fire that smelled of things Han preferred not to investigate, arguing in the low, contained way of people who have been furious with each other so long that volume seems beside the point. He watched from behind a collapsed oak long enough to identify which of them stood nearest to her oldest enemy. 3 stones, placed at the right angles, reopened old wounds and confirmed a suspicion one witch had been nursing for years. The 4th made contact with someone, and that was enough to snap the prohibition entirely. 5 spellcasters losing their tempers simultaneously in an enclosed space do not produce an elegant magical event. The explosion was the structural kind, the particular consequence of allowing years of mutual hatred to finally express itself without restriction. Han was already behind the oak, back flat against the bark, hands pressed to his ears. When the ringing cleared, he walked back into the clearing. Major XP reward. Environmental defeat bonus. His level had tripled. Health remained critically low, but the gap between who had entered that clearing and who was walking out of it had widened considerably. He wiped ash from his sleeve and started northeast toward the creek. He had a great deal of work to do, and he preferred to begin before anyone in this new world had reason to notice his arrival. 2 days of forest survival followed. Not comfortable, but productive. Han knew where the edible plants concentrated near the creek's bend, where roots held water after rain, and from another run, that the forest's northeastern edge opened onto a hunter's trail connecting to the regional road. He navigated without the meandering that burns time and energy. By the second morning, rest and adequate food had brought his health back from the critical red to something workable. The man who found him on the second afternoon was not looking for him. Rudd was a hunter, the solitude by choice kind, not the circumstance kind. He had spent enough years working that particular forest that he read its patterns the way a sailor reads the sky. He came across Han sitting on a flat rock beside the creek, eating fish caught with a method that combined resourcefulness and necessity in roughly equal measure. Rudd sat down on a nearby stone without ceremony. He pulled dried meat from his pack and set it beside Han, making nothing of the gesture. Han took the meat, they ate. Rudd was the quietly observant kind, already noting the unusual stillness in the southwestern sector, the cleared tracks through the forest floor, the faint chemical trace of old explosive magic still hanging over the trees. He assembled these details at his own pace. When he asked where Han had come from, Han gave an answer accurate in outline and brief on detail. Rudd received this the way a patient man receives an abbreviated answer. He noted the gap and did not push. He asked instead whether Han had somewhere specific to be. Han said he had goals rather than destinations. Something in that satisfied Rudd. He stood, offered his hand, and said his camp was 2 hours north. Han was welcome to sleep under a real roof and eat properly before moving on. In earlier playthroughs, Rudd had appeared in Han's awareness as a secondary figure, a name in a regional record, a capable hunter, someone he had passed without stopping. Meeting the man in person was different. There was a directness to him that Han did not often encounter. No angle behind the offer, no secondary interest being served, just a competent person who had decided another person needed practical help and had simply begun providing it. That quality, simple enough to be almost invisible, turned out to matter considerably. The camp was built for function and nothing else. Supply jars labeled and organized on a shelf, a structure positioned to deflect weather, traps laid in a pattern that only an experienced eye would recognize as deliberate. Rudd cooked without ceremony and put food on the table that was better than anything Han had managed since entering this world. After dinner, Rudd went to a chest in the corner. He returned with something wrapped in cloth, fossilized bone, dark gray, dense, warm to the touch despite no visible heat source. He set it on the table and explained. Pulled from a dragon-class creature 3 years ago, useless to his own build configuration, sitting in the chest unused since. Any player whose stats aligned with physical growth would find it considerably more valuable. Han already knew exactly what it was. He had found the Dragon Bone trait before, in a different run, through a process that had been significantly more dangerous and expensive. Receiving it now, this early, from a man who offered it simply because someone else could make better use of it, was the new world already adjusting the math in his favor. The bone dissolved into his palm the moment he held it correctly. His system panel rewrote itself in seconds. Strength doubled, endurance tripled, health regeneration shifted from the thin trickle of an unclassed player to something capable of sustaining genuine combat. One trait, applied at the right moment, had fundamentally rebuilt who he was as a fighter. The person who had survived the witch clearing on the barest possible margin was now genuinely difficult to kill. Rudd watched the absorption with the quiet interest of someone who still found rare system events worth noticing. He remarked that Han had taken to the bone faster than anyone he had offered it to. Han said the bone must have recognized something compatible. Rudd made a short sound, the private kind that means a joke has landed without requiring acknowledgement. The training began the following morning without formal agreement. Rudd demonstrated a tracking technique and observed. Han performed it correctly on the first attempt. A second technique. A third. By midday, Han had executed everything presented and asked a specific question about a regional variation that Rudd had developed independently over years and never shared with anyone. Rudd stopped. He stood with one hand resting on a pine trunk and studied Han for a long moment. He asked, again, where Han had genuinely learned this material. Han said he had read extensively. Rudd filed this with the other abbreviated answers and said only that in over 20 years of working this territory, he had not seen progress like this. If Han planned to remain in the region, Rudd would prefer he stay near the camp rather than moving independently through the forest. What Rudd interpreted as extraordinary talent was, in truth, something more complicated. Every technique he demonstrated had existed already in Han's memory from previous playthroughs. The patient hours of teaching Rudd believed he was providing were, from Han's side, careful confirmation of material he already held, local variations worth noting, refinements to absorb, but nothing requiring learning from nothing. 2 years of normal apprenticeship had collapsed into 3 months of efficient review. Rudd never turned resentful. Some people, watching a student surpass them ahead of any reasonable schedule, find ways to create distance between themselves and that fact. Rudd went the opposite direction. He opened everything he had kept private. Locations never put on any map. Seasonal patterns observed through decades of solo work. Techniques developed alone and never taught. He seemed to find it genuinely satisfying to watch Han receive these things and build on them. Near the end of the 3rd month, Rudd sat across the camp table from Han and said that he had a contact in the mercenary placement network, a man named Rebus Schultz, who organized assignments for hunters transitioning to broader work. Rudd didn't give recommendations casually, he said. He intended to give one for Han. Another time through this game, Han had reached the mercenary network through a combat tournament that cost him 3 cracked ribs and a week of recovery. Getting there this way, because a man he had genuinely come to respect had decided, without ceremony, that Han was worth endorsing, sat in a different place. Better. He thanked Rudd. He meant it completely. The next morning, he replenished the dried food stores he had eaten through, packed his equipment, and followed Rudd's handwritten directions east toward the city. Rudd stood at the camp entrance and watched him go. What remained between them didn't require words. Rebus Schultz established himself within the first 30 seconds at a tavern near the eastern gate. Compact, direct, sharp-eyed, in the way of someone who had assessed hundreds of mercenary candidates and become suspicious of strong recommendations because they were usually oversold. He read Rudd's letter, looked Han over, and declared that the letter had set expectations he had not anticipated being able to meet. Han waited. Rebus said the expectations had held. The paperwork was ready before the food arrived. The assignment Rebus described was not entry-level work. An organized orc force had pushed deeper into the eastern territory than anyone had projected, breaching supply lines, cutting off 3 settlements, applying pressure the regular army was struggling to absorb. They needed auxiliary fighters capable of operating without logistical support, in terrain that punished the underprepared. Han signed the contract. He knew this conflict from earlier runs. the Orc general's tactical tendencies, the terrain's key choke points, which supply route would be targeted first, and how many fighters were needed to hold the eastern ridge. Most importantly, he knew the name of the cavalry commander who would arrive on the battle's third day. Valpurgis. He had watched her die in 4 separate runs. The first time, he had been positioned too far away to intervene. He simply witnessed it, helpless, with the specific clarity of watching something terrible from a distance you cannot possibly cross in time. In the second attempt, he had taken a different route and arrived an hour too late, finding nothing but a broken standard and ground that still smelled of violence. Runs 3 and 4, he had been present, had fought beside her, and she had died anyway, each time for reasons rooted in decisions made before he arrived, in political choices and troop deployments he had not yet learned to reach. This was the 5th run. 5 playthroughs of understanding about what killed her, not just the immediate cause, but the entire upstream chain, the betrayals, the misplaced trust, the sequence of failures that created the conditions. He knew now where it began, and how far back the intervention needed to start. Every piece of that knowledge he intended to use. The caravan east left before the city woke. Han sat in the back of a supply wagon with his equipment beside him, watching the gate shrink in the distance. The orcs ahead were a known problem. The terrain was already charted inside his memory, and 3 days away, Valpurgis was riding toward a battle she had never survived in her own timeline. He had decided, in this run, that she would. The mercenary camp outside the eastern settlement was the organized kind of chaos. Supply wagons parked at angles, soldiers from 3 different guilds sharing fires without enthusiasm, the particular atmosphere of people waiting for orders that hadn't arrived yet. Han moved through it quietly, taking stock of faces and positions against the map he already held in memory. The mercenary commander was a broad man named Holt, who had the look of someone perpetually annoyed that the war had not yet resolved itself. He processed the new arrivals by scanning their gear and asking one question each. What had they done before this? Han said hunting, primarily. Holt assigned him to the 3rd Auxiliary Unit, the one positioned furthest from the main line, behind 2 rows of actual fighters. The traditional placement for anyone unproven. He took the assignment and found a fire. The first evaluation came on the 2nd morning, a skirmish probe at the Northeast Trail. Holt sent 3 auxiliaries to assess movement, Han among them. The other 2 treated it as reconnaissance. Stay far, observe, return. Han cut left where the tree line bent and arrived behind the orc scouts before they reached the trail junction. He handled it fast, returned with the scouting party's standard and equipment, and was eating bread by the time the other 2 got back. Holt stared at the items on the table. He moved Han to the 1st Auxiliary Unit that same afternoon, with a new contract rate and a question, whether Han had a preference for squad composition. Han said he wanted 3 specific names he had already identified in the camp. Experienced fighters who had worked the Eastern Territory before and knew when to move without being told. Holt approved all 3. The battle proper began on the 4th day. The orc force was larger than the regular army's preliminary count had allowed for, a common problem when your scouts were assessing an enemy that had been deliberately shifting positions to obscure its true scale. The eastern ridge held for the first 6 hours because the terrain funneled the assault into a corridor where organized defense still worked. By early afternoon, that advantage was dissolving. Units began pulling back. Not breaking, the formal distinction mattered to military pride and meant almost nothing to the physics of the situation. Han's squad had been assigned the banner point, the position at the center of the eastern corridor that marked the army's official line of advance. Abandoning it required a command order, which meant someone had to cross open ground to request it. What actually happened, as the units on either side began contracting, was that the banner point became isolated, a small group holding a position that the formation around it had already stopped holding. Holt sent a runner with the retreat order. The runner didn't arrive. Han saw why before anyone else did. The northern corridor had already collapsed, which meant the fastest route back was cut, and the runner had presumably arrived at that conclusion at the worst possible moment. The squad waited. The orc forces pressed forward. Han looked at the situation, calculated the available options, and picked the one that everyone else was not choosing because it appeared unreasonably bold. The orc general's command structure worked through a specific totem positioned at the rear of the advance, the symbol of authority around which the tactical chain organized. Without it, command broke down at the unit level. He had discovered this in a previous run during a completely different battle and stored it without specific application in mind. Application had arrived. He told the squad what they were doing. Two of them absorbed this without visible objection. The third asked if Han had looked at the number of enemies between them and the totem. Han said he had counted. They went anyway. What followed was approximately 11 minutes of the most concentrated violence Han had experienced in this world so far. The squad moved in coordinated sequence. Not the parade ground kind, but the battlefield kind, where every person reads the gap and fills it without being told. The Dragon Bone's physical enhancements made Han significantly harder to stop than his appearance suggested, and he moved through the press with the efficient economy of someone who wasn't wasting effort on anything that didn't lead directly to the objective. The totem came apart under a specific technique Han knew from previous playthroughs that neutralized its protective enchantment first. The orc advance immediately began to fragment at the edges, small unit leaders looking to the rear for direction that was no longer coming. The squad retrieved the totem's insignia, which functioned as a battlefield trophy under the mercenary contract's specific terms. Holt found them at the perimeter. He looked at the insignia. He looked at Han for a long moment. He asked whether Han had planned that in advance or improvised it. Han said he had identified the opportunity when the retreat order failed to arrive. Holt said that was either one of the most impressive things he had seen in 20 years of mercenary work, or Han was lying about how much he knew ahead of time. Han said he could accept either interpretation. The squad's retreat back to the main line was the tense kind. The forward orc units were already adjusting to the lost command structure, but adjusting took time, and they used that time well. By the time they reached the main fortification, the eastern corridor had closed behind them. Han leaned against the wall and let his hands stop shaking, which they had been doing since the 6th minute. Small cost relative to the outcome. He accepted it. What he had not yet accepted, standing at the wall while Holt processed the situation with increasingly wide eyes, was the sound coming from the direction the army had been retreating toward, high and clear through the lowering afternoon. Cavalry. Not the Eastern Army's cavalry, which had been positioned at the western flank, and was therefore impossible in this direction. Something else. He knew the sound before he saw it. Valpurgis arrived the way she always did in that particular encounter, at a pace that made the orc unit responsible for cutting off the retreat deeply, immediately regret its positioning. She commanded her cavalry with a precision that seemed disproportionate to the available space, reading the terrain and the enemy formation simultaneously, placing each element of her force where it produced maximum disruption. The orc general, large, armored, the kind of enemy that ended most fighters by being simply too much to deal with. She handled herself. Han watched from the wall. He had read about this engagement across 4 runs, heard other characters describe it, arrived at the aftermath with second-hand accounts and battle reports. He had never been present for it. Watching Valpurgis command in person was different from every account he had absorbed. The reports described results. Positions taken, enemies routed, objectives achieved. They didn't capture the thing underneath the results. The way she made decisions faster than most people formed the question. The way her presence altered the behavior of the fighters around her. The way she made violence look, paradoxically, like the cleanest possible solution to an ugly problem. The orc general fell. The route cleared. Han lowered his hand from the wall's edge, where it had been gripping without his noticing. The formal recognition ceremony happened 3 days later in the main fortress. Military awards were distributed in descending order of rank, meaning, in practice, that everyone with a title received theirs first, and the mercenaries waited while the afternoon stretched. Han waited without particular impatience. He was watching Philip. The steel elector moved through the room the way powerful people move in spaces where their power is taken for granted. Unhurried, receiving the attention around him as its natural due. He was tall, composed, the kind of competent that showed in small economies of movement. Han had respected what Philip represented in the game's structure, across every playthrough where he had encountered him. This version of Philip had the same quality and the same flaw. He had learned to trust his own assessment of situations above any information that arrived from unexpected directions. When Han's turn came to approach for recognition, a brief, formal exchange of military credit, he stepped close enough to speak without being overheard. He said there was information about the northern road he thought Philip should consider. a specific formation vulnerability, visible only from the approach angle Han had taken during the totem engagement. Signs consistent with a prepared ambush, not the opportunistic kind, but the pre-planned kind that required inside coordination. Philip received this the way a man receives an unsolicited analysis from a mercenary he has never heard of before this afternoon. He was not rude. He was simply certain, in the contained, polite way of someone who has already filed the information in the category of things that didn't require follow-up. He thanked Han for his service. He moved on. Han watched him go and felt the familiar weight of knowing what comes next. In every previous run where he had been positioned to observe what happened after this moment, Philip's dismissal had not changed the outcome. The ambush had its own momentum. It had been arranged weeks before this conversation took place, by a man inside Philip's own family, who had concluded that Philip's position was worth more than the loyalty owed to someone who held it. Philip's uncle had been working with a faction called Pessimut for the better part of a year. The arrangement was not complex. Access to Philip's movements, vulnerabilities in his political position, private information about upcoming military deployments. In exchange, preserved wealth, a protected estate, and the assurance that when Philip's influence collapsed, the uncle's would not collapse alongside it. Basic treachery, executed with the patience that makes basic treachery occasionally effective. Han had 3 days before the Northern Road movement was scheduled. He used them to prepare for the ambush's aftermath, because the ambush itself was not stoppable from his position. He had no evidence Philip would accept, no relationship that would lend his warning credibility, no institutional standing that made him anything more than a mercenary who had performed unusually well in a single engagement. The decision Philip had made in that ballroom to not take the warning seriously was not reversible from outside. What Han could affect was what happened after. The ambush came at dawn, at the second road junction where the northern route narrowed between two forested ridges. Han had positioned himself east of the junction the night before, in the tree line at an angle that gave him the broadest possible view without putting him inside the killing ground. The light was still uncertain when the first movement began. Philip's convoy entered the junction on schedule. The attack came from both ridges simultaneously, not orc forces, not a foreign enemy, but a coordinated military strike from the Pessimut alliance, fighters who knew the convoy's timing, its composition, and where its defensive arrangement was thinnest. Philip's uncle had been thorough. The convoy fragmented within the first 90 seconds. Philip was extracted under protection, not of Han's making, but of the small personal guard that had remained loyal despite everything. Val Purgis, who had been riding at the convoy's rear with her own contingent, found herself cut off when the rear extraction point collapsed. She rallied what fighters remained around her and held a position at the junction's southwestern corner. Han saw Philip's guard moving north. Moving north meant away from the junction, away from the rear position, away from Val Purgis. The movement was quick and decisive. Philip's guard had been given an objective: extract the elector, and executed it cleanly. Whether Philip gave the order explicitly, or simply allowed his guard to fulfill their standing directive without countermanding it, the outcome was identical. He left. Val Purgis saw it happen. Han saw her see it happen. She held the position for another 4 minutes after Philip's guard vanished over the northern ridge. The kind of holding that becomes its own form of statement. She fought for ground that no longer had a tactical reason to be held, because abandoning it immediately would have said something she refused to say. The fighters around her matched the intensity without understanding the reason for it. They were still outnumbered. A creature emerged from the eastern tree line that ended the position's resistance in under a minute. Hexax moved with the specific efficiency of something built for precisely this kind of situation. Fast, armored in ways that normal weapons struggled with, carrying a whip made from a material that absorbed defensive enchantments rather than being blocked by them. She handled Val Purgis's remaining guard with a methodical brutality that made the remaining fighter's choice simple: retreat or be added to the demonstration. Val Purgis did not retreat. She fought until her health hit critical levels and Hexax's whip caught her guard arm at an angle that made continued fighting physically impossible. She was captured. Han had been running east from the moment Philip's guard began moving north. The terrain between his position and the southwestern corner was 400 meters of open road and rough ground on the junction's southern edge. He covered it at a speed made possible by the Dragonbone's enhancement and something else less quantifiable: the specific kind of urgency produced by watching the same death approach 4 times across 4 different attempts and finally being close enough, positioned correctly enough, to possibly do something about it. He arrived at the junction's southern edge, while Hexax was still organizing the extraction. What followed was not the kind of fight that makes a good story in a ballroom. It was close quarters, and exhausting, and several times in the middle of it, Han could not have identified which direction he was facing. Hexax was faster than any enemy he had faced in this world so far, and considerably more durable than her physical frame suggested. The whip created problems at every distance. Too close and it wrapped. At range, it cracked against any defensive position he tried to establish. 3 specific things won it. The first was knowing, from a previous encounter in a different run, that Hexax's left side defense had a structural gap when her whip arm was mid-swing, a fraction of a second where her posture put weight on the wrong foot and her left side opened. The second was the Dragon Bone's enhancement, which meant Han's strikes landed with enough force to matter when that gap appeared. The third was that Hexax had already exerted herself neutralizing Valpurgis's guard and was operating below peak capacity. He exploited all 3. Hexax lost an eye. The pain and the damage to her depth perception changed the engagement immediately. The whip required precise spatial judgment that a missing eye disrupted. Han pressed the sudden advantage and didn't stop pressing until Hexax made the calculation that disengaging was the superior option. She withdrew east, fast, into the tree line. Han knelt beside Valpurgis. Her health was deep into the critical band, the kind of number that didn't allow for deliberation about whether to use the healing potion he had kept, at some cost to other supplies, since the 3rd day in this world. He used it now. The potion was expensive, high grade, and worked in the particular way of good healing items in this system. Not instantly, but fast enough that the critical numbers began moving in the right direction within a minute. He waited beside her while the process ran. He set his hand near hers on the ground, not touching but close. The unconscious movement of someone keeping watch over something valuable. He had been trying to reach this moment for 4 playthroughs. He wasn't sure what he had expected it to feel like. Mostly what it felt like was relief, plain and absolute. The way relief feels when it arrives after a very long time of not having it. Valpurgis opened her eyes while the potion was still working. She looked at the sky for a moment before her gaze found Han. She was not the kind of person who gathered herself slowly. By the time she had taken 2 measured breaths, her assessment of the situation, her position, his presence, Hexax's absence, the battle sounds already moving north, was essentially complete. She asked, in a voice that was rougher than usual from exertion, who he was. He told her he was a mercenary who had been at the Junction engagement the previous week. He named Holt's outfit and the banner incident. She was quiet for a moment. She said she had heard about that. He helped her sit upright when she indicated she was ready. She moved through the return to vertical with the careful economy of someone managing pain without making it visible, and Han recognized the effort required and said nothing about it. The way you say nothing about something when acknowledging it would make it harder rather than easier. She looked at him for a longer moment than felt entirely casual. He held it without comment. She asked why he had not left when the junction fell. He said he had prior information suggesting she would be isolated at the rear position, and he had decided to act on it rather than wait. She received this, in the way she seemed to receive most things. Completely, without visible performance, processing it genuinely. She said something then that he hadn't been expecting. She told him that Philip's guard had been doing their job, that the elector's protection was the official priority, and no one had failed in any duty by fulfilling it. Han said he understood that. He also understood that official priority and correct priority were not always the same thing. Something shifted in her expression, small and fast, the kind of shift that only matters if you happen to be paying attention. She looked away first, east toward where Hexax had withdrawn. She asked what he intended now that the junction was lost. He said he intended to follow the situation north and find out how bad the political damage was going to be, because some of what was coming next could still be managed if handled early. She said that was an unusual priority for a mercenary. He agreed that it was. They moved north together, through the rest of the afternoon, and said very little. She was testing whether she could walk at pace without the legs showing the damage clearly. He was letting her determine that on her own terms, at the distance she set. At one point the path narrowed around a fallen trunk, and she reached for a branch for balance without thinking about it, and her hand found his arm instead, because he had already shifted position when he saw the footing change. She removed it after a moment. Neither of them addressed it. The military camp they reached that evening was in the kind of controlled emergency that large operations enter when something significant has gone wrong, and no one has finished determining how significant. Philip was present, under heavy guard, in discussions that appeared to be moving quickly toward the conclusion that his political position in the Northern Territories had just become substantially more complicated. His uncle had already disappeared from the record, physically, conspicuously absent in a way that answered questions Philip hadn't known he needed to ask. Philip saw Valpurgis across the camp. Han watched his face during those few seconds. Philip held it well. A more casual observer might have seen nothing at all in his expression. Han saw the specific look of a person who has understood that something they cannot undo has been done, and who has not yet fully arrived at living inside that fact. Valpurgis gave Philip no acknowledgement. She turned away and moved toward the medical station. Han filed it. The recognition ceremony was much less formal this time. No ballroom, no descending order of rank. Holt arrived with amended contract documents and a count of the engagement credits. He set the papers on a camp table, sat across from Han, and asked whether Han had been planning to eventually tell him that he had prior knowledge of the ambush, or if he was simply going to keep being mysteriously right about things indefinitely. Han said he had warned the appropriate authority through the appropriate channel. Holt looked at him. He said that was a genuinely impressive degree of self-control under the circumstances. He raised the contract rate again and asked whether Han had a preference for future assignment types. Han said he was interested in anything that put him in proximity to the political developments following this engagement. Holt said that was, again, an unusual priority for a mercenary. Han agreed and signed. It was late that night, at the edge of the camp where the firelight stopped and the open country began, that he sat alone with something he had been avoiding examining since the afternoon. The timeline was already different from anything in his memory. Philip's uncle's move had come 2 weeks earlier than expected, a detail that changed the chain of consequences significantly. The battle positioning had been altered in ways he hadn't anticipated. Minor variations, some of them, but in a system as interconnected as this one, minor variations accumulated into structural divergence. He had survived on previous run knowledge throughout this opening arc. The Witch Clearing, the Dragon Bone, Rudd, Rebus, the Orc Totem, the Junction positioning, every one of those had been possible because his memory aligned closely enough with this world's facts that the old knowledge held. If the alignment was shifting, the further he moved into events, the less reliable that map would become. He thought about what Aquila had said about VIP status, about the special anniversary world built for a particular kind of player, about the ways she had looked at him during their conversation in his apartment, not with the interest of someone offering a transaction, but with something more like the interest of someone watching an experiment already underway. He had assumed the anniversary world was a new version of the game, altered in cosmetic and presentation ways but structurally similar to the runs he remembered. He was now operating on a different assumption, that someone, or something, with far more access to this world's architecture than any player possessed, had deliberately altered it. The where was knowable. The why was harder. The why was what he intended to find out, somewhere behind the political wreckage of the next several months. First, though, there was Margarita. He knew, from detailed knowledge of the game's hidden roots, that the woman the high abyss of the Valparis convent had become was not what she had been before the corruption took her. He knew what the curse required. He knew what undoing it would cost. He had spent 2 previous runs identifying the specific sequence that made it possible at all, and in neither run had he been in a position to attempt it. He was in that position now. The Convocation's records described it carefully, in language clearly written by someone hoping to discourage exactly what Han intended to propose. The curse could be transferred to a willing host, if the host possessed specific attributes, if certain relics were in place, if the ritual conditions were met. A willing host who survived the transfer would emerge with altered capacity, darker, more powerful, fundamentally changed in their relationship to the skills available through the game's darkness framework. A willing host who did not survive would simply be dead. The angel's heart was the variable. It sat in the convent's lower storage, placed there by a nun named Angela, who had carried it for years in the particular way of someone caring for something precious that has no current purpose, attentively, without knowing when the purpose would arrive. The relic's recorded function was returning a soul that had departed under specific conditions, not any death, not permanent death, but the specific kind of death produced by darkness curse transfer. Han stood up and looked north, where the mountains that separated this territory from the convent's region lay across the night sky. 2 weeks of travel. One extremely difficult conversation with a distrustful nun. One conversation with a woman who had been lost to corruption so long she might no longer remember who she had been. And one agreement that required him to step into a process with a known, calculated chance of not surviving it. He had stayed alive by knowing what was coming. What was coming next was something he had planned for, was ready for, and had decided to do regardless. That was a different kind of knowledge, not the accumulated kind from previous runs, but the quieter kind that arrives when a person has decided who they are and what they are willing to pay for it. He turned back toward the fire. There was work to prepare before morning.